Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Officer Training School. Today, we're going to be talking about the Leman Russ Exterminator. Now, before we get into the rest of this, I know I put up a poll recently, and a lot of you guys said that you wanted a mega video on the Leman Russes. But I realized that this particular variant of the Leman Russ probably deserves its own video because it is what I would say is the most divisive unit in the entire Guard Index. Another thing I want to talk about, if you did not see this in the last video, of course, I did update this in my Ko-fi page, and someone mentioned that it is pronounced coffee. I actually looked it up. It is supposed to be able to rhyme with no fees, so that's cool. I don't know. Anyway, if you're interested in this, I recently updated it to include all of the lists on a second sheet. So not only does it have the match history, who played it, where, and all that fun stuff, you can also now see everything that they brought in their list by just clicking on the next sheet. Once again, you can get it completely for free on my Ko-fi page, and there will be a link to that in the description. Now, okay, I already touched about this, but I have seen so many very passionate discussions on Reddit and Discord where people will talk about how good the Exterminator Leman Russ is. And one of the most fascinating things to me about this is that guard players who are very strong are on both sides of the fence. Guard players have both played it and really liked it, and they've also played it and really found it not worth its points. And it ultimately depends on what your playstyle is like in order to determine how good you think this is. It's undeniably not a bad unit, but where exactly you want to be bringing it in your list is another question. The other thing I will say before we get into the rest of this is these videos are very heavily targeted at people who are looking to play Warhammer tournaments. If you are looking to be better at Warhammer 40k, if you're looking to be better at the Astra Militarum, and you're looking to go from like a 0-5 or a 1-4 player at a GT to someone who's getting, 2-3 or 3-2, this is really for you in order to try and help you understand what units you should be looking at when you're building your lists. I will say right now that I don't run the Exterminator very much. I do not think that the Exterminator fits my playstyle basically at all. I have only ever run it in one RTT, and then I've played it in a couple of games here and there beyond that. But the one RTT I did run it at, I went undefeated, went 3-0, and then I immediately cut it from the list after that. That doesn't make it a bad unit. We'll talk a lot more about this in the rest of the video. Okay, going over what we're going to be talking about today, we're obviously going to be covering all the basic stuff, the Exterminator basics, how you want to be equipping it. We're going to compare it to the Leman Russ battle tank with a battle cannon. Then we're going to be talking about Withering Hail and what you should be thinking about when you're actually trying to apply this buff, what units pair really well with Exterminators, and then from that point, we're also going to be comparing it to a Hellhound, which provides a lot of similar utility. Then we'll go ahead and wrap things up by talking about the orders and stratagems that you can be using on these tanks to get the most effect out of them, and then wrapping up with a couple small strategy discussions. So, basics. The Exterminator is a mid-range fire support tank. Unlike what we were talking about in our Rogel Dorn, it's pretty rare that you actually want the Leman Russ Exterminator to be playing in the midboard. It's not necessarily something that's going to be sitting on objectives a lot of the time. It's not necessarily going to be contesting tight angles against your opponent in most of your games. But what it does do is it synergizes very well with other units in your army that have low AP shooting. With all this in mind, you generally want to play it around the edge of your deployment zone in most games where it can hide and really just pick off one target at a time. But the other thing about the Exterminator is it has some strong competitors in similar roles to what it is that you're trying to do. It is a durable gun platform that does decent damage, and it can make the rest of your army potentially way better. So, how do we equip this tank? Well, it's pretty simple. You're going to start off with the Exterminator autocannon because you have to take it. It's what makes it an Exterminator. Then we take a las cannon, and then a heavy stubber and a hunter-killer missile. The only real options that you have on how you're going to be equipping your Exterminator is whether or not you want to be going multi-meltas or plasma cannons. Of the 7 lists that have taken Exterminators, 5 of them have taken multi-meltas, and 2 of them have taken plasma cannons. The big trade-off kind of being how open the rest of the board is and how effective you're going to be wanting the plasma cannons because they are fairly effective into marines and other similar things. In general, most players are preferring the multi-meltas just because they give you the opportunity to spike really hard into tough targets, but plasma cannons do have a place. Now, before we start talking about the ability that makes the Exterminator so special, we need to compare it to the Leman Russ battle tank. And it kind of makes sense. You take a look at their gun and it's very similar. The Exterminator has a 4 shots with rapid fire 4, 48-inch gun at strength 9, AP 1, damage 3 that is twin linked. The battle cannon is D6 plus 3 blast shots at strength 10, AP 1, damage 3. Very similar on its face. And another thing that makes it very similar is the twin-linked portion of the Exterminator autocannon is largely identical to what you're actually seeing with the rerolls to hit provided by the Leman Russ battle tank. What this ultimately means is that against almost every single target before you're getting +3 blast, so anything with 15 or more models in it, the Exterminator and the battle tank are doing nearly identical damage within a few percentage points, right? If the Exterminator will kill 4 models, the battle tank will kill 4 models almost every time. But this is only true if the Exterminator has take aim and the Leman Russ battle tank has full rerolls against a target on an objective. Now, neither of these prerequisites are particularly hard to find, but it is also worth noting that the Leman Russ battle tank, while ordered, even if you're only rerolling ones, is always going to do more expected damage than an Exterminator against nearly every target. That's not necessarily a big difference, but it's important to understand that the Leman Russ battle tank does do a little bit more damage on average. Now, this isn't usually a large difference, but it is important to note that if you just want raw damage, the battle tank is a better firing platform, but not by so much that it's a complete just one way. So with that in mind, these two tanks can play pretty similar roles. But here's a couple of things that you should be considering about whether or not you want to be bringing the Exterminator versus bringing a battle tank. The first one is how many orders do you have? If you're running a list that is light on tank commanders or you're trying to do something with Outlord Solar, then suddenly the battle tank looks a little bit more appealing. But if you have plenty of orders, then the Exterminator is going to be doing decent damage anyway. The other important consideration, how much AP does your existing shooting have? If you're already running 2 battle tanks, you don't need a 3rd battle tank. You really want to make the first 2 battle tanks more effective, so you should be looking to bring an Exterminator. However, if you're bringing all Demolisher cannons, they don't care. They're already AP3, which puts everything that has an invul on that invul. So, instead, you should be looking at the battle tank. I personally like the battle tank because it's a strong rapid ingress threat or reserves threat. You can bring it in, and it's going to do its job without an order, and so it's a little bit more threatening than a lot of people might expect it to be. The last major consideration is, do you need a tank that can play the midboard? The Leman Russ battle tank is not very good at playing the midboard simply because its main gun is blast. It cannot shoot into its own combat. However, the Exterminator can do so, so there are some trade-offs to bringing the Leman Russ Exterminator versus the battle tank. Ultimately, I would argue they're about side grades if you're just comparing them on their own. So let's then move on and talk about what it is that makes the Exterminator special. The Exterminator's ability is Withering Hail. And what Withering Hail is after you shoot at a target with your Leman Russ and have hit the target at least once, which is very easy, every Astra Militarum unit in your army that shoots at that same target within the same phase benefits from having an extra AP on all of their guns. Now, there are a couple of small terms and conditions that you do have to remember here. The first one is that it finishes after the Exterminator is done shooting, not just the autocannon, all of the guns on that vehicle. Cannot shoot the autocannon first and then be, haha, now my plasma cannons are AP4. The other thing is it does not affect anything that you are allying into the army, such as a Calidus Assassin or Canis Rex. Neither of these things are particularly hard to play around, but it is worth noting that that is not something that you can use in order to buff up a knight that you're potentially looking to bring. Okay, now it's time to start talking about math. Why is this ability so good? 40k is a game about breakpoints, right? When you're dealing damage to something and you have one model live versus the entire unit dying, it's a huge difference. Some easy examples of this are if you're playing against Custodes and they spend 1 CP to bring a model back, that's nearly 4 inches of bonus movement that you just gave to that unit. Additionally, that unit can now just hide all over the place and do actions. The difference between having one model alive and no models alive is huge. Now, that's an obvious one to think about. However, we also have to look at where the breakpoints are in the rest of the game. In 10th edition 40k, you can generally assume that almost everything in the game will have cover always. So, going from AP0 to AP1 doesn't matter because most things you really care about shooting are going to have a 3-up save or better. And so, going from AP0 to AP1 does not improve your damage output against those targets. AP2 is the first breakpoint they have to think about because AP2, even if they're in cover, you're now actually reducing their save a little bit. The really, really big breakpoint in 10th edition 40k that you're almost always looking for is getting to AP3 because it means that even if they're in cover, everything that has an invulnerable save is now on that invulnerable save. You cannot get better than that. This is really important, and why things like the Demolisher Cannon, Las Cannons, and Plasma Cannons don't really care about having an Exterminator because they are already putting things on an invulnerable save anyway. As an important corollary to this, Armor of Contempt and similar stratagems do suddenly mean that AP4 is the new AP3 for some armies. Alright, a couple of other really important breakpoints that you have. AP5 means that things with a 3-up save no longer get a save even if they're in cover, and then AP6, if you are a 2-up save, you no longer get a save even if you're in cover. Now those are harder to get. There aren't a lot of things that are already AP4 or 5 that we really need to be worried about. It's mostly just Meltas and the Vanquisher Cannon, which are basically punching through anything that doesn't have an invul anyway. Now that's all well and good, but I really want to help you understand the math that you really need to be thinking about. Because a lot of people look at saves and they think about them wrong. People will look at a 2-up save and be like, oh yeah, I make that every time. But every time your opponent is rolling for a 2-up, what you should be thinking about is this mathematically equivalent to you looking for a 6-up. Because saving on a 2+ is an 84% success rate for your opponent, but that means it's a 16% success rate for us. So one of the things we're really looking to do is we're trying to move something from a 2-up save to a 3-up save, because that will double your damage against that target. If it helps you think about it in a different way, it's the equivalent of from going from a 6-up to a 5-up. We're literally doubling the number of shots that you're going to be getting through. In a similar spot, moving your opponent from a 2-up save to a 4-up save triples your damage output against that target. So one of the things that the Exterminator is really helpful for is it takes things that are already on this 2-up save and puts them on 3-up and 4-up saves, which can double or triple the damage output of guns that you're going to be shooting at it. But again, kind of what we were talking about, we need to find things that care about that distinction. Demolisher cannons, melta guns, plasma cannons almost never care because they are already AP3 or better anyway. So we also need to think about what else we can do to improve our AP. Withering Hail can only affect a target once, and this is specifically called out in the ability for the Exterminator. However, Fields of Fire does not have the same clause, and so you can affect a target multiple times with the Fields of Fire stratagem. This means that if you have Ursula Creed in your army, you could potentially buff the AP of your entire army by up to 3. And on top of that, if you can also get Ignores cover from your Hellhound, you can ludicrously have your lasguns functionally have AP4. It's not really an important breakpoint, but it is pretty funny. So suddenly, if you have both an Exterminator and Ursula Creed, you suddenly have an opportunity to really kind of pick and choose what kind of saves your opponent is taking. Now, with all of this put together, I think we need to start talking about what it is about the Exterminator that really becomes valuable. And it is really a reverse engineering problem. What weapons do we have that are good except for the AP that they have? Shouldn't be a surprise that one of the most common things that we see paired with the Leman Russ Exterminator is a Rogel Doran. And that's because the main gun, the Oppressor Cannon, is AP2. We really, really want the Oppressor Cannon to be AP3, so everything that has an invul is always taking that invul. Similarly, the autocannon that it has, which for some reason has a bonus ballistic skill, is AP1. If we can get that to AP2 or AP3 as well, suddenly we're putting out a ton of high AP damage 3 shots. A couple of players have recently had some success with this, including Peter Melendez at Spring Assault and Michael Costello at Partisan Games. Another very strong pairing that we see all the time is Chimeras. Chimeras, with their Heavy Flamer or the Heavy Bolter, already have AP1 and Ignores Cover on the Heavy Flamer. And importantly, as we kind of touched on before, Ignores Cover is almost as good as AP, which means that the Chimera Heavy Flamer is functionally already AP2. If we can add an Exterminator to that, suddenly the Chimera's Heavy Flamer is functionally AP3, which is the breakpoint we really want to hit. And this is part of why some of our strong players like Nick Jagiello and Taylor John Morton have both gone 4-1 pairing Chimeras with the Exterminator. A brief note before we move on to other things that really like Exterminators. One of the reasons why we don't generally use the Exterminator as a frontline midboard battle tank is because we are very oftentimes pairing it with Rogel Dorns and Chimeras. I would recommend watching the officer training school that I've already made about the Rogel Dorn, where we talk a little bit about how durable this tank really is. Most of the time, the Rogel Dorn and the Chimeras are going to be standing in front of the Exterminator, which means that we can play a little bit more safely with the Leman Russ. Okay, other things that really like Exterminators. Leman Russ battle tanks. The battle cannon on a Leman Russ battle tank is also only AP1, but we have seen success with players like Richard Cozart going 6-2 at the Dallas Open. In general, it is usually better to have one Exterminator and one battle tank than 2 of either. Also, Kazarkin and Silence, which have hotshot lasguns, which are already AP1, really like Exterminators as well for a little bit of bonus punch. We've seen Eduardo Rinaldi go 4-1 at Conquest Italia with this. And then lastly, Manticores with Storm Eagle rockets are AP2. If we can get that to AP3, because they're shooting indirect most of the time, it does mean that everything will be put on their invul if they have one. As we touched on a little bit earlier, Ursula Creed is also a very strong pairing with Manticore, simply because we have easy access to plinking off Fields of Fire on targets that we want to. And it's worth noting that of the 7 lists that have run Exterminators in this most recent data slate, 6 of them also ran Ursula Creed. Let's take a quick detour as well and talk about the Hellhound. Considering how easy it is to get cover in 10th edition, if you're playing any version of competitive terrain, including Player Place, Games Workshop, WTC, or UKTC, you're going to have cover on almost every shooting activation always. Because of this, Ignore's cover is almost as good as having that extra AP. And a Hellhound has a very similar rule where if you shoot something, that you get to pick one enemy target that unit can no longer get benefit of cover. And so, the Hellhound has a couple of benefits going for it. One, it's cheaper. Currently, as of the most recent data slate, is 55 points cheaper. That is an entire unit of Catachan or a unit of Scions that you can bring in addition to a Hellhound in order to get your Exterminator. It's not quite as durable, but it's very nearly as durable, and it's also less order reliant. Because it's usually bringing Flamers, it's going to be auto-hitting with everything. It's also a better Overwatch threat than the Exterminator. However, the Exterminator does more damage than the Hellhound. And even if it's not a large difference, it is more durable. The other thing that you really need to think about with Exterminators is that cannot double up on Ignore's cover, which means that things that already have Flamers, like Chimeras, are not going to be benefiting from a Hellhound. So this is where Exterminator can shine. If you're planning to bring Rugal Dorns, you can think a little bit more about bringing Hellhounds. Planning to pair it with Chimeras, you should definitely be looking at Exterminators. It's worth noting that as of the time that I wrote this, the Hellhound has appeared in the same number of winning lists as Exterminators. On the April data slate, they have both appeared in 7 lists. Ultimately, they're both good units, but they're both buff units that are fulfilling a very similar role. Alright, let's go ahead and start talking about the orders and stratagems. Just like if you watch the Rugal Dorn video, this is going to be pretty fast and a little bit sarcastic, because you don't really need to think about this one too hard. If you're going to be giving an order to an Exterminator, you're going to be giving it take aim, because it makes you shoot better. And if you can shoot something, you're going to shoot it good, when we like shooting good. If you could not see something with take aim, but you could end up shooting something with move, 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 you're going to give move, move, move instead. You know, because shooting slightly worse is better than not shooting. The only other order you're ever really going to be giving to your tanks is Duty and Honor, because sometimes being OC4 is cool. The other ones, we're not even going to talk about them. They're just really bad. Okay, now let's talk about the stratagems, though. Now, there's a couple stratagems that are just complete baits. First one, Smokescreen. I talked about this before, but the kind of things that are going to be shooting at you that you're worried about killing you are usually going to kill you anyway. If Eldar are shooting you, they get a free reroll baked in. If Space Marine Ironstorm is shooting you, they're probably using Oath of Moments on that target, or they're shooting at you that has something that has a reroll built into the tank. If another guard player is shooting at you, he's going to put so much firepower into your tanks that the difference of having Smokescreen is probably not going to keep your tank alive. So it's very rare that you actually use Smokescreen. Armored Might, which is the -1 damage one, is also shooting phase only, and it almost never saves you either. The only thing that I've seen this actually have a mathematical difference against is getting shot by, like, Votan Thunderkin and Space Marine Hellblasters. And then they usually still kill you anyway. So it's usually not worth it. Lastly, Overwatch on a Leman Russ Exterminator, huge bait. Like, you're going to be killing, on average, like, 1 Marine. There are way better targets spending RCP on. If you're going to be using Overwatch, do it with something like a Hellhound, a Rugal Dorn, or Tempestus Scions. Let's talk about some stratagems that you could actually use, though. First one is Tank Shock. Tank Shock, which on a Leman Russ is Strength 7 for some reason, which is the same as a Rugal Dorn, is going to get you about 3 mortal wounds into most infantry targets, simply because they are toughness 6 or less. It's not a bad thing to use to, like, kill a Terminator or finish off a low-health vehicle, but you really need to kind of understand, like, how much damage you're actually going to be doing with it. It's about as good as throwing a grenade. The other one is Fields of Fire. Now, it is worth noting that if you're using Ursula Creed to use Fields of Fire, you are supposed to pay for the first one. And so if you're planning to use double Fields of Fire that turn, you might as well use the first one on the Exterminator, such that everything that fires after the Exterminator gets 2 bonus AP. It also helps in that you don't have to shoot a third thing in order to get all the access to AP. You just need to shoot the Exterminator and then Creed's Mortar that she just has, like, chilling in her backpack. So now we're going to get to the opinion pieces. And I know that this is actually a Leman Russ Annihilator with the las cannons, but there's simply not that much art of Leman Russ Exterminators. And I like doing art more than doing photos of people's things. I don't know why, but I just don't. It doesn't feel right to me. Anyway, only about 1 in 6 lists that are going 4-1 or better are actually bringing Leman Russ Exterminators. And the big reason for this is that I would say the Leman Russ Exterminator falls into nice to have tier. Even in lists that are bringing units that like being supported by an Exterminator, you don't need to. And the number of points that you're spending on an Exterminator can get you like 2.5 units of infantry. Some players like Chris Daly and Nicholas Weiss have both gone 4-1 with double Dorns, with no Exterminator and also no Hellhound. They're just raw dogging the double Dorns. And ultimately, a lot of the units that exist in nice to have tier are good enough to justify putting in lists. An easy example of this is a brick of 15 Tempestus Scions is also really nice to have because you can use it to root out people in the enemy backfield. A Basilisk is also nice to have. They're all good units. The other major thing about Exterminator and why it's not appearing in as many lists as some people think it should is there are a lot of lists that it just doesn't do anything for. The first archetype is similar to what we've seen from David Purcell. He's gone 4-1 at Gigabytes and Dice Goblin, and he went, I think it was 5-2 at another event. And he's running triple Demolisher Tank Commander and triple Vanquisher. And all of their guns are already AP3 or better anyway, which, as we already talked about, is the most important breakpoint in the game. Anything beyond that is just gravy. As we touched on before, Exterminators really want to have orders because they are reliant on it for a lot of their damage. Rory, or whatever his real name is, because it's a video game alias, effectively, in France, went 4-0-1 with a draw, running Leman Russ battle tanks, because he didn't have enough orders to actually effectively support the Exterminators. Other players, like Marshall Peterson, who's gone 4-1 at Snake River, the Bay Area Open, and Wargames for Warriors, is running a list that is doing most of its damage from melee. And in a list that is this tight on what it's able to bring, you can't afford to spend points on things that are nice to have. You are all in on one strategy, and if that strategy doesn't work, well, bringing the Exterminator is not going to make it work. Another player that I've talked about a lot, Paul Clifton in China, has also had a lot of success. He has brought an Exterminator in what is mostly a melee list, but after talking to him, he's also said the reason why it's an Exterminator is because he didn't have enough points in order to make it a Demolisher. So ultimately, you do have to make some pretty key decisions on how much support you want to bring in your army and how much just mainline damage dealers or scoring pieces you want to be bringing. Personally, I like leaning on more self-sufficient units. But, as evidenced by the several lists we've already referred to, and you can check more of them out on the Ko-fi, it is completely valid and it is strong to try and build into more of these cool combos. So with all that said, let's go ahead and wrap up some of this discussion by talking about the general strategy with Exterminators. First one is Exterminators are flex pieces. Or they aren't quite as flexible as something like a Hellhound or Kazarkin or Tempestus Scions. They can fulfill more than one role in the battlefield. By default, like we've already touched upon, they are going to be spending most of your time around the edge of your deployment zone as a mid to long range fire support. But because of what we generally pair them with in terms of Dorns and Chimeras, the Chimeras and the Dorns are usually going to be further forward, and so you don't necessarily need the Exterminator to be playing as aggressively as these other pieces in order to get as much use out of it as possible. However, in games where you do need to fight for the midboard, it is totally okay to play Exterminator up in the midboard. It is still a Leman Russ chassis, which makes it very durable, and there are going to be games where you need that little bit of extra units in the midboard. You need a little bit more OC, a little bit more damage. And because the Exterminator is not a blast weapon, you can get it into combat if you really need to. It's important in competitive 40k to not lock yourself into, this is what the unit is best at, so that's what it's going to be doing. Instead, you need to be thinking about what the unit can do, and if it is good enough in that role to still find you wins. Second major strategy piece I am going to recommend to everyone is you don't usually want to run more than one. Of the 7 lists on the April data slate that have run Exterminator, none of them have run a second Exterminator. They've all run just the first one. And a major reason for this is because, as we've already touched upon, it is competing very heavily in the damage profile with a Leman Russ battle tank. And you've seen a number of them, instead of going with a second Exterminator, bringing a battle tank instead. Part of this is very rare in a game that we have a situation where we want to put Withering Hail onto 2 targets in a single turn. Usually, there's just the one thing that we really want dead. And so we're going to take our entire army to make sure that that one thing dies. And then any extra damage that we can do on the board is just nice. Like, we like doing that little bit of extra damage, but it's not the reason why we're bringing it. Now, because we're generally only going to be bringing one, there are going to be some armies that we really want to protect this unit. Armies like the Votan, which can clean it up relatively efficiently, and Ironstorm, who can rip a Leman Russ to shreds. You're going to kind of want to slowly pick off different pieces of the opponent's army. Even if it's not the target that you absolutely want to kill, if it's a target you can kill this turn while still keeping your pieces alive, this is a perfect example of a time that the Exterminator, you might kill the Gladiator Lancer instead of the Repulsor Executioner this turn. The last major strategy piece that we want to talk about is stacking buffs against a single target, particularly against what I call super hard targets, like a Tan, the Avatar of Cain, super heavies, and sometimes some types of Terminator bricks. You're going to want to layer buffs against them. Some armies, like the way I normally play, is I will kind of ignore these pieces and just drip feed them trash units to keep them busy. But if you have an Exterminator, it becomes easier to actually take them down. If you use an Exterminator in Fields of Fire and remain stationary, suddenly you get a lot of lethal hits and a lot of AP, and you take their 2-up save into a 4-up save, which, as we've already talked about, means that you are tripling your damage against these targets. Now a Chimera with double heavy flamers and take aim is doing on average 3 wounds to an Avatar of Cain. Doesn't sound like a lot, but we're also shooting at it with a Chimera, which has las guns and heavy flamers. That adds up a lot. And that's not even one of the pieces that we're looking at where we are really trying to do damage with a Chimera. But because we're layering buffs on one target, suddenly we're able to take down units that a lot of our opponents might not expect us to be able to. That's about all I have to say on the Exterminator right now. It is a unit that falls in nice to have tier. It is a good unit, and it's hard to deny that. However, whether or not it is worth including in your list is going to depend a lot on what else you're going to be putting in your armies. If you want to bring Chimeras or Rogel Thorns or Manticores or Basilisks, Exterminator starts looking a lot better. However, if you want to play more self-sufficient units or a melee army with the Tillen Rough Riders or Bulgrin or Demolisher Cannons, it's not important to be bringing Exterminator. So I hope that, if nothing else, this guide has helped you understand that there are a number of viable strategies that we can have in the Astra Militarum at this point. This might change in less than a month when the new data slate comes out. But for now, we can do a lot of different things. We have pretty good internal balance overall. As I touched on before, I'm planning to do probably 2 more videos on Leman Russ variants in 2 major categories. The first category is going to be frontline tanks. These are going to be things like the Leman Russ Demolisher, Punisher, Eradicator, and surprisingly, the Vanquisher. Then we'll have another conversation later about what I call deployment zone Leman Russes. These are tanks that normally play on the edge of our deployment zones, like the Leman Russ Battle Tank as well as the Tank Commander. And in some games, the Leman Russ Vanquisher. Quick reminder that once again, if you want to take a look at the winning list, I am continuing to update it, and there is a link to all this in the description. In particular, Nick Jagiello for talking to me about how he likes to use the Exterminator with Chimeras. Others include David Purcell of the Southeast US, Paul Clifton of China, Mike Askey of the UK, and Matthew Searle of Oceania. If you like what I do and are interested in supporting me, please check out the Ko-fi link down in the description. Nothing is ever required, but anything is always appreciated. I've been thinking about setting up a Discord as well, if that is something people are interested in. I've been mostly hanging out in an Imperial Guard Discord, but if other people are interested in getting one set up based on this channel, I could get that set up pretty easily as well. We are slowly inching closer to unlocking memberships. We are slowly getting closer to unlocking memberships on YouTube, and hopefully that, that can help me support some of this hobby. But with all that said, once again, this has been Josh with Joushi Howard. We've been talking about the Leman Russ Exterminator here at the Officer Training School, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.